Welcome to the Shepherd's Wallet podcast, financial guidance that speaks pastor. I'm Seth Scott, and I help ministry leaders navigate the unique financial complexities that come with answering God's call. Pastors face one of the most complex financial situations of any profession, yet there's a shocking lack of targeted, useful information available to help them. That's what we're here to change. If you've ever felt overwhelmed by housing allowances, confused by SECA taxes, or frustrated that generic financial advice doesn't address your unique ministry situation, you're in exactly the right place. What if I told you that a single 30-minute conversation could save you $1,500 every year for the rest of your ministry? Today, we're walking through exactly how to ask your board for a SECA offset, what to say, when to say it, and how to handle every objection. Let's turn that tax penalty into a tax advantage. So today I'm taking the role of your interview coach because we're going to be going to your church board and we're going to be requesting that they do something called a SECA offset for you with regard to your compensation. And a little explanation of what that is. So we've talked about the dual tax status that pastors have on this podcast many times. In a nutshell, the IRS considers you as a pastor self-employed, even though you are treated for all other purposes as an employee of the church. It ends up being sort of the worst of both worlds. You're locked into your compensation as an employee. Normally a self-employed person would be able to have full control over their work and would be able to go out and get more business and all of that. But you are an employee, so you don't have the ability to scale your own income, but you're still treated as self-employed for tax reasons, meaning that you are on the hook for both sides, so to speak, of your Social Security and Medicare taxes. So most employees pay FICA taxes, which is only half of the total burden of Social Security and Medicare. It ends up being 7.65% of their compensation. And then their employer is required through payroll taxes to match that with their own 7.65%. That's pretty much every other employee out there. You, however, and every other self-employed individual, because you're considered both the employee and the employer at the same time, you have to pay them both together, 15.3% total. So the church, if you were a normal employee, the church would have to be paying that 7.65% of your compensation, but they don't have to do that since you're self-employed for IRS purposes. So more and more churches are doing this. It's becoming more ubiquitous. It's becoming, dare I say, best practice that churches will voluntarily pay you an additional 7.65%, calling it a SECA offset. Because you're self-employed, they're not allowed to just pay it on your behalf. So it's not a dollar for dollar offset, unfortunately, because it just comes to you as additional compensation, meaning you have to pay self-employment taxes on that 7.65% on top of normal income taxes. So it's not perfect, but it is the single most powerful way that pastors can turn their inherent tax disadvantage from having to pay both sides of Social Security into an actual tax advantage. And then when you combine that with other strategies such as the housing allowance or such as 403B contributions, which can also reduce your SECA taxes, then now we're really off to the races and we're really having fun, really optimizing your situation as a pastor and leveraging all these tools together. But again, far and away, the most powerful thing your church can do for you to help level the playing field with you and other types of employees is to voluntarily provide a 7.65% offset on top. So today we're going to talk about how to initiate that conversation with your board if they're not doing this already. And this feels hard, I get it, but I think in your mind, we got to reframe this as you're not asking for a raise, even though you probably deserve one. Pastors go a long time typically without getting things like cost of living increases, much less raises for their performance and what have you. But this is not a raise. We're not talking about that. What you're asking for is fairness, because you are in an inherently unfair situation tax-wise that can be rectified if your church treats you just like they would have to if you were any other kind of employee. Now, the cost of not having this conversation. I'm throwing around this kind of 1500 value a lot. And I recommend you go to my blog, shepherdswallet.com/blog, and look for my article this week on 2 ways churches can reverse a pastor's tax disadvantage. And what I did was I did a deep dive tax analysis on the median income for a pastor, which is $58,920 per year. That's the median household, and that's the median pastor income, according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics. So when you do the analysis and look at what you're paying versus what a secular employee would be paying at that same compensation of $58,920, even if we assume a 30% housing allowance, which is kind of where they end up being, you end up paying as a pastor $1,563 more in taxes compared to the secular employee. That's over 21% difference in the actual taxes that you pay federal. And we're not talking state taxes at all. This is just federal. So that's significant. That's a mortgage payment every single year. And the church can be the biggest tool in your tool belt as far as leveling that playing field and addressing that inequity. So that's the cost of not having this conversation. I know that it's uncomfortable, to talk about compensation with your board, or it can be. I don't think it has to be, but I understand that. But the cost of not having this conversation is, if you're in that median household, if you're in that median pastor salary of around 58, 59,000, and that translates to over a $1,500 per year disparity, that's $130 a month forever that you're leaving on the table by not at least having this conversation. So here's what you do to prepare for this meeting. It shouldn't take you long at all. First, I want you to complete and print out the free tax calculator that you can get by going to my website, again, shepherdswallet.com/tax calculator with a dash in between. So tax dash calculator. You can also just go to the tools section, and it's called the Pastor Tax Estimator, and you can just download it. And it's really easy. You put in your wages, you put in your housing allowance, you put in whether your church gives you a SECA offset or not, you put in your 403B contributions, and it spits out a comparison between your taxes and a secular person's taxes. And that's a great visual just to show, look, if I was a normal employee, this is what I should be paying in taxes, and yet I'm paying way more just because I happen to have an unfair tax status that is unnecessarily increasing my taxation. So the second thing you're going to do is you do a little bit of research. You can find lots of information out there. Again, my blog post from this week is a great resource for you. It shows other denominations and churches that are leading the way as far as documenting that, yes, this is best practice. Churches should be doing this. Identify your champion on the board, your person of peace. That I think the Bible talks about that. Who's going to be your biggest advocate, and really maybe just share with them and show them ahead of time what's going on, and then also the timing, when to have this conversation, close to when your board is already addressing the budget for the church, which they should be doing every year, is probably the best time to do it. Maybe a month or two before that. So here's a script that I'll give you for the opening of this meeting. I'm the minister. I'm coming in there. I'm saying something like this. I'm saying, thank you for giving me a few minutes to discuss something I've recently learned about pastoral compensation and taxation. I want to be a good steward of both the church's resources and my family's finances, so I've been researching how clergy taxation works. What I discovered surprised me. Because of something called dual status classification, I'm currently paying about $1,500 or more in federal taxes each year than someone doing identical work at a secular nonprofit. And you can put that, 1,500. Instead of that, you can use the actual number that comes from the tool that you can download from my website. This happens because I'm required to pay both halves of Social Security and Medicare taxes, 15.3% total, while other employees only pay half, 7.65%, with their employer matching the other half. Now, I've prepared a simple comparison showing the exact numbers for our situation, and then you'd give them that single-page summary from the tax estimator tool. As you can see, on my current compensation of whatever it is, I pay X more in taxes than a secular employee would. Many churches have discovered that they can address this inequity by providing what's called a SECA offset, essentially paying the 7.65% that they would pay if I were classified as a regular employee. This isn't a raise or a bonus, it's simply the church paying what it would already owe for any other staff member. So that's a loose script that you can follow, make it your own, and then come again armed with the printout from that tax tool. Come prepared with those other examples that I have from my blog post, just real quick. United Church of Christ explicitly recommends a SECA offset in their compensation. The United Presbyterian Seminary considers it best practice. United Methodist Church does it. Baptist churches are doing this. So there's lots of documentation out there of this not being your idea. This is not just a newfangled thing. This is something that a lot of churches are already doing and considering best practice. So here's the script for the actual request. So you lay the foundation with what we just talked about. And then you say, I'd like to respectfully request that the church consider adding a 7.65% SECA offset to my compensation package. And this is what it would mean. The church would increase my stated compensation by 7.65%, which would bring my effective compensation in line with other employees. The cost to the church is exactly what you would pay in payroll taxes for any other staff member, and this is a recognized best practice recommended by United Church of Christ, Presbyterian, United Methodist, these kinds of things. Look at your denomination too and see if they have any material out there about this SECA offset idea, and that would be even more powerful for you. Now you can continue. I want to be clear, I'm grateful for my current compensation and for the opportunity to serve the Lord here. This isn't about wanting more money. This is about tax fairness and ensuring that I can be a good steward of my family's finances while serving the church faithfully. All right, so that's your script. It doesn't have to be flowery. It doesn't have to be pounding the table angry. It's not their fault. This is the IRS that has put this into your lap. And so we're just trying to do our best to be good stewards with the situation that we have. Let's go over some objections that you may face from the church board on hearing this idea. One objection might be you already get a housing allowance. Isn't that enough? And behind this question is what I think is kind of standard knowledge that people who understand about the housing allowance can assume, well, pastors don't pay any taxes or pastors pay less taxes. And you would think that's the case, but the fact is that the housing allowance just seeks to offset the unfair tax advantage that pastors have. And especially for middle to lower income pastors, it doesn't come close to doing that. You're still in a worse off situation, even with a housing allowance. And so this is a very common objection that you may come across because your board may assume, it's like, well, you already have a favorable tax situation. Isn't it greedy to ask for more? When the reality is that you're in an unfair situation that's just hidden in the weeds. So here's a response that you could give to that objection. I understand why it might seem that way. The housing allowance is indeed a blessing, but here's what a lot of people don't realize. I still pay the full 15.3% self-employment tax on that housing allowance, even though it's excluded from income tax, and that might be news to them. So while the housing allowance helps with income taxes, it doesn't help with Social Security and Medicare taxes, and in fact, it increases them. The numbers I've shown you account for the housing allowance benefit, and even with that, I'm still paying X amount more annually than a secular employee. I imagine that's going to be a big eye-opening moment for your board. It was an eye-opening moment for me when I sat down and did these numbers, and I want to equip you to be able to share the truth about your situation in real numbers. A second objection, we can't afford this. I mean, fair enough. You know the financials of your church better than anybody. And a lot of churches are hand to mouth when it comes to this sort of thing. There's not a lot of meat on the bones, so to speak. And it might be very well true that the church cannot afford this with their current levels of giving, with their current budget. My response to that would be something like this. I do appreciate the church's financial realities, and I want to be sensitive to that. But I have two thoughts with response to that. First, this 7.65% is what the church would be legally required to pay if I were any other type of employee. So it's not really an additional cost. It's actually standard employment cost. Second, if the full amount is impossible right now, maybe there's a way to phase it in over 2 to 3 years. Even a partial offset would help significantly. You can start with maybe a 3 to 4% and work up to the full amount over a few years. So, show that you're willing to negotiate a little bit. You're not trying to bankrupt the church by just being a stick in the mud about this. You're willing to work with them because, again, something is better than nothing. And at least now everybody's on the same page as far as the inequity that needs to be addressed. A third objection you might hear is, well, we've never done this before. Well, yeah, you're right. And I appreciate that new ideas take time to consider. This would be my response, though. What's encouraging is that this practice is becoming standard across many other churches as boards and denominations learn about the tax inequity. And you can share again the examples from the list from the blog post of different denominations. This is where you can pull out actual sources if you want to be that way about it. That's how I would do it because I'm a super nerd. But you do you. You can continue. I'd be happy to provide resources from church law and tax or our denominational offices that explain this practice. Church Law and Tax, by the way, is it's an annual volume that's put out by Richard Hammer, who's a CPA and also a lawyer, and he does it's the gold standard as far as I'm concerned, when it comes to matters having to do with law and taxation for churches and for pastors. It's a very dense book and it's very heavy. Uh, I try to break it down and make these concepts as simple as I can, but that's a great resource for the church to have, at least to have on hand for looking up things about housing allowance and dual status taxation and Social Security opt out and how that all works. But yeah, the church law and tax. And you can conclude with this objection. We'd actually be joining many other churches in ensuring fair compensation. Fair compensation is your leaning in phrase on this. Again, you're not asking for a raise. This is just making it fair. And then a fourth objection you may hear, doesn't this create inequity with other staff? And, if you've been listening so far, you know that it's actually the opposite. So this would be my response to that. That is a thoughtful question, and it actually highlights the current inequity. Right now, the church has to pay 7.65% in payroll taxes for every employee except for the pastors, except for me, except for the pastoral staff. The SECA offset doesn't create special treatment. It actually eliminates special negative treatment that we've received under the law. After the offset, all employees would effectively have the same employment tax structure. And finally, the fifth objection could be something like, didn't you opt out of Social Security? So why do you need that extra SECA offset if you don't pay SECA taxes? Uh, I wouldn't say this part, but just so you know, one objection that comes to my mind is that it's actually none of the church's business whether you've opted out or not. For those of you that need a refresher, ministers have the unique ability to opt out of Social Security and Medicare by signing Form 4361 with the IRS. And that exempts your ministerial income from counting towards your Social Security and Medicare benefits, and thus exempts you from having to pay self-employment tax on your ministered compensation. Now, again, that's not the church's business. You file that form directly with the IRS. It doesn't affect your compensatory relationship with the church one way or the other. That's not public knowledge who has filed and who hasn't filed. So really, it's a matter of privacy that you may have offered that information to the board or to some members of the board, but I don't believe that should be used against you in these negotiations. And again, there's the fairness of it as well. If some ministers have opted out and some ministers haven't opted out, well, the ones that haven't opted out, they get a 7.65% offset, but those that don't get that. I just don't find that fair. But anyway, here's the script that I would use if that objection is brought up. And I would say, actually, opted out ministers need the offset even more. We've given up Social Security, disability, and Medicare benefits that other employees receive. The 7.65% the church pays for other employees builds their federal benefits. For opted out ministers, we need that same percentage to build our own safety net. The offset isn't a windfall, it's the church helping us replace the critical benefits that we've sacrificed for our religious convictions. And if they continue to push back, you can bring up the fairness thing. Consider this: every other employee has 7.65% going towards their retirement security through Social Security. Opted out ministers have 0% going towards federal benefits. The offset simply levels the playing field, allowing us to direct that same percentage toward our own retirement security. It's actually the most equitable approach for everyone. Now, we've talked to opted out ministers before in this podcast. I think a few weeks back, we had an episode just for opted out ministers where I talk about how to replace those benefits. So I recommend you go back and listen to that. But you really should, at the very least, be taking that 7.65% offset if the church gives it to you. And if you are opted out, you should be using that money to build your own safety net to replace the benefits that you've given up by opting out. So, what do you do with if they say yes? I mean, say yes is great. Thank them sincerely. Uh, get it in writing. Clarify the implementation timeline. Like, how soon can we expect to see this come through in payroll? Offer to help with any paperwork or payroll setup, and suggest reviewing annually because, again, it's nice to have the SECA offset. You should be getting cost of living increases at the very least. You should be getting raises, just like you would in any other position. These things are notoriously rare when it comes to pastors and churches. And so I think if you get a yes on this is a great foot in the door to embolden you to start talking about fair compensation in these other ways, with COLA increases and things like that. Now, if they say no, we're going to be gracious about it, right? Again, it's like they're not legally required to do this as a church. Again, this is the IRS's what they've put into your lap. And, it would be a gesture of goodwill and it would be fair and it would be in line with these other churches if they did do it. But again, they're not legally required to do it. So I suggest being gracious and saying something like this: I appreciate you taking the time to consider this and I respect the board's decision. May I ask what additional information might be helpful for future consideration? I'd also like to request that we revisit this during the next budget cycle, as I believe addressing this tax inequity is important for the long-term financial health of the entire pastoral staff. In the meantime, would the board be open to exploring other ways to support the financial well-being of the ministry staff? And in my blog lately, I've been talking about this new service that I just put out. I'm going to talk about it more next week in detail, but it's something called the Pastor Financial Wellness Partnership Program, where I can partner with churches to cover their pastoral staff financially in certain ways on the church's dime. And so there are ways that the church can help, such as that program. There are other ways that they can do it too. First is they can get a 403b-9 plan. It's called a church retirement plan. Uh, a lot of churches don't have any kind of retirement plan, so this would be an excellent bonus because it would allow you to reduce your own SECA taxes by contributing to the 403b plan. It has to be a 403b though, and so there are some churches that still have 401ks. Technically, the church is not allowed to reduce your self-employment income if it's a 401k. It has to be a 403b. And so if your church has a 401k, switching to a 403b is a compliant way for you to help address the SECA inequity on your own with good retirement planning to boot. You can also request professional expense reimbursements. Something called an accountable reimbursement plan is something that's nice to have. It's a way for your church to offset your ministry expenses in a way that is legal and compliant and that doesn't add to your tax burden. That's something they can look into. Ask for a continuing education budget for yourself and for the pastoral staff. Negotiate extra vacation time, right? If they're not able to give money, maybe they can give you time. We all know that pastors are overworked anyway, so I think you'd probably jump at this opportunity and maybe request that they cover or at least help cover your tax preparation fees, because you go to a CPA, they're going to see the clergy complexity. You're already in the 500, 600 plus range just for them to do your taxes, because they don't do a lot of clergy taxes, and it is legitimately complicated to do it correctly. So following up after this, send a thank you note. Just be classy about it, regardless of the income. If yes, again, you got to get it in writing. Make sure it's recorded in the minutes of the meeting. If no, a calendar to revisit in maybe 6 to 12 months and see if God has had a chance to work on their heart on this. Feel welcome to share anonymized results with the Sacred Capital community. You can go to shepherdswallet.com/join. Join our free Facebook community. The whole point of this community is so that users can share stories like this, whether they're success stories or setbacks. And we're all here to support each other, give advice, commiserate with you, celebrate with you, whatever the case is. And then I have closing encouragement for you here and just reminding you that you're not being greedy with this request. You're being wise. And the conversation gets easier the second time. So maybe practice it with your spouse or practice it with another pastor. Maybe they'll also get the same idea and do it for their board. And you guys can keep each other accountable for that. Your future self and your family will thank you because, again, this is hundreds or thousands of dollars a year that the church can help offset for you. And every pastor who does this makes it easier for the next one. And again, you could be advocating for your entire pastoral staff if you have more than one on staff. So here are some key reminders. You want to keep the tone educational, not adversarial. Again, the church hasn't done anything wrong by not doing this. They're, I assume, compliant with the law in other ways, but certainly in this way, they're not required to pay that 7.65% FICA tax. So we're taking a partnership approach with this. And use we language when possible. This is just basic negotiating tactics here. Have all the documentation ready in your back pocket. You don't have to overwhelm it with them right off the get-go, but have it ready in case some of these objections that we talked about came up. And like I said, practice with your spouse or maybe another pastor friend first. Really get it down so that it's almost like a script that you can just read and rattle off, and you're not having to do a bunch of ums and uhs and thinking about it. Come in with confidence and strength because this is a reasonable and fair request. And of course, pray, pray, pray. Pray before, pray during, pray after, pray without ceasing, as Paul tells us. And just go in with confidence because remember, you're not asking for special treatment. You're asking to be treated the same as every other employee. So that's not just reasonable, it's right. So here's your next steps. Download the tax calculator, shepherdswallet.com/tax calculator with a dash in between. Practice these scripts that we talked about here and just go and have the conversation. Just eat the frog, as they say. Just get it done as soon as you can, whenever is right for the budget. Just make it a priority to make this happen. Your family's financial future is worth 30 minutes of potential discomfort. Bless you, Pastor. Thank you for joining me on the Shepherd's Wallet podcast. I hope these strategies help you steward your sacred capital with greater confidence and peace. If you found this helpful and would like to go deeper in your stewardship journey, join the Shepherd's Wallet community at shepherdswallet.com/join. You'll get weekly live Q&A sessions, pastor-specific financial tools, and a community of fellow ministry leaders committed to faithful stewardship together. Also, you can pre-order my upcoming book, Shepherding Your Finances. It's the comprehensive guide to everything we talk about on this show, plus implementation worksheets and strategies you won't find anywhere else. Pre-orders are 35% off for a limited time at shepherdingyourfinances.com. Thanks for listening, and remember, you are worthy of double honor, including the honor of proper financial guidance. See you next week.